Petroleum versus PetrOLAtum. Are they the same thing? Do they actually come from oil refineries? Are they toxic to put on our skin? You see, petroleum or PetrOLAtum jelly is what's found in Vaseline. It's what's in the Selimo jelly that I personally use. But this ingredient has been hated for so long online. Yet you can find it in La Mer for $400. We need to talk about what this ingredient actually is, why it's in skincare, and most importantly, where and how it was discovered. Because originally, some of the naysayers are right. It was found because it was an oil byproduct from the oil industry, but people found a way to reuse and replace it. Now, the big question, does that make it toxic or bad? Let's talk about all of this and dive into the history and the differences between petroleum and PetrOLAtum jelly. This all starts in the 1800s in a small town called Titusville, Pennsylvania. This was the birthplace of the American oil industry. This guy named Edwin L. Drake was from the north, and he was sent down to this town in Pennsylvania to find crude oil. At the time in the 1800s, this crude oil was turned into kerosene to light people's lamps and keep their homes warm. And one day in 1859, he struck rock oil. He found this crude oil, which was essentially petroleum. And this was the start of the oil rush. People started coming in from all over, creating wells and refineries just to get to this crude oil. Now, this crude oil is also called something else. It's called unrefined petroleum. Now, this petroleum, also called crude oil, was really valuable because it could be used to make kerosene and gasoline and even diesel, to power motors and things that we now use all the time. It's a specific mix of hydrocarbons that are found naturally in rocks, and when extracted, they have all these uses. Now let's talk about hydrocarbons, because that sounds really scary, and a lot of people online,
specifically the wasp and almond moms,
like to talk about how hydrocarbons are so dangerous. But what is a hydrocarbon? It's basically something that's only made up of hydrogen and carbon. Carbon, what you and I are made up of. Hydrogen, what you and I are made up of. Water, hydrogen. Yes, it's just hydrogen and carbon together. And specifically for this crude oil or this unrefined petroleum, it's a substance or a liquid that is made up of exactly that. Now, this petroleum is very unique because you can think of it as like a blend of mineral oil as well as paraffin wax, the stuff that people used to and still make candles out of. But nature has combined it in a way that you can't really separate it. Or if you mix mineral oil and this paraffin wax together, you can't get the same result. And what was happening is that as these workers from all across the eastern side of America were swarming to this town in Pennsylvania to get their hands on this oil, they would work really hard, and yes, they would get cut. They would get scrapes and scratches, especially when working with this large machinery. Now, this petroleum was being taken out from the earth, but when you actually drill into the earth with this well, there's something that forms on the machinery called rod wax. And this rod wax was kind of a nuisance. They were always trying to get it off of the machinery. But for those people who had scrapes or cuts from their work, they noticed if they put some of the dirty rod wax on their hands or on their arms or on their fingers, it would actually heal faster than if they didn't use it. Now, this was all well and good, and people were making wells and earning good money from this, but one day a young chemist heard about this interesting rod wax that people were using to heal their wounds. Robert Augustus Chesebro was on the same mission to find materials that could be used for kerosene for these lamps, but he was looking at them from sperm whales. Yes, people actually used to kill whales because they had a ton of oil in them. And when he heard about this new place in Pennsylvania where people were getting this crude oil for kerosene, he was really intrigued. So Robert traveled to this region to find out about this rock oil, and he saw some of these men, covering their hands and their wounds in this rod oil. He was absolutely fascinated. You see, he was born in London, but kind of grew up in New York, and he was obsessed with chemistry. And he was wondering, what is in this that people are putting on themselves that is helping them so much? So he began to study this substance. He started collecting it, and then he started refining it. You see, crude oil can kind of be mucky. There's a lot of nasty particles in there because it's literally being drilled up from the ground. But he found ways to distill it and to filter it, and he came up with this very interesting jelly-like substance. And it was literally just these hydrocarbons that he called Wonder Jelly. He was so fascinated by this that he decided to patent it in 1965, and he started selling it locally. He had it in these little glass jars, but they started to sell out really quickly. He decided he needed a better name for it, especially as it was being shared around. And he decided to take inspiration from the word Wasser, which means water in German, and Olin, which means oil in Greek. And that's how he came up with the name Wasser-Olin. Vaseline. And he did this in 1872, which is how Vaseline was created. Again, it was this rod wax that was purified, it was distilled, and it kind of became this transparent goo. And after cleaning it, he packaged it and yes, started to sell it for wound healing. appealing. Now, the process of getting petroleum jelly from being this rod wax to actually being a jelly that can be used on the skin is a huge process, and it's changed dramatically throughout the years. It specifically undergoes distillation with really high temperatures to burn off any of the gasoline and kerosene. Remember, this petroleum originally is used to create gasoline and kerosene, so all of that gets removed as it's being processed. Then it goes through a process of deasphalting, basically removing any of the waxes and oils that are left over, because a lot of times when you pull something up from the earth, it can have a lot of impurities in it. And sometimes it was even filtered through bone charcoal. Now, that process has obviously become refined today, and Vaseline is still on the market. Now, Vaseline today is not cruelty-free, which is why I don't use it, but the actual raw ingredient, the petroleum jelly that literally comes from the oil and is purified, that's technically a natural substance, okay? So for everyone who's calling it toxic and disgusting is subjective, but like, it is technically natural if you want to call it that. I mean, it's technically hydrogens and carbons, no? And here's what's interesting is that there are more brands like Solimo jelly, which I buy because it is cruelty-free, that you can get over the counter. And yes, I have put this on my skin, but a lot of people like to point at this and say how disgusting it is and how it's so bad for you. But at the same time, if you see PetrOLEum or PetrOLATum in a skincare ingredient list, we're talking about the same thing. Like, it's literally in La Mer for everyone who's calling it gross. Now, what is the actual difference between PetrOLEum and PetrOLATum? Remember, petroleum is what's dug up from the earth that you can make this kerosene and gasoline with, and it's normally kind of this brown, goopy, liquidy texture. It's also known as crude oil, and it can have a lot of these impurities like other waxes or, yes, kerosene and gasoline. Now, PetrOLATum is slightly different. It's basically this stuff, but it's purified. PetrOLATum is white and translucent, and it's gone through this distillation and this deasphalting and all of these processes to make sure that it is free of those impurities. So while they're basically the same thing, they're hydrocarbons. This is the raw form that you get from the rocks, and this form is the one that has been purified or processed, which technically mean the same thing here, purified and processed. So if anyone's saying, oh, it's so bad that skincare is processed, okay, call it purified. Are you happy now? So interesting what the beauty industry will try to pull right over your eyes. Now, here's the thing is that everyone is saying that, you know, it's toxic and it's so bad for your skin, but is it really? One thing that people point to is that Europe has supposedly banned Vaseline. Well, is that actually true? No, and here is the truth. First, before we call it toxic, let's define what a toxin is. A toxin is defined in the medical and microbiology community as something that is, quote, a poison, frequently used to refer specifically to a protein substance produced by some higher plants, certain animals, and pathogenic bacteria that is highly toxic for other living organisms. In layman's terms, you can think of this as like bee venom, snake venom, or spider bites. Now, the California government says that the toxicity of a substance depends on 3 factors. Number 1, its chemical structure. Number 2, the extent to which the substance is absorbed by the body, and number 3, by the body's ability to break it down. And you think about it, some people swallow this petroleum jelly. This has been seen as relatively non-toxic. Heck, even water can become toxic to the body if you drink too much of it. Did you know that water can become a poison? Yes, it can.
If you drink too much of it in too short of an amount of time and the body can't process it, your electrolytes get imbalanced and your brain starts swelling and you die.
We don't want to do that, okay? But for everyone who's calling this so toxic and bad, first off, anything can be a poison at the right amount. Number 2, it's not necessarily toxic, and it's actually been shown to have low toxicity and low allergy potential. Literally, some people eat this stuff. I'm not saying you should, but some people do. That's not very toxic. Now, a lot of people also point to the fact that it's banned in Europe. Well, again, is it really? No, and let's talk about that. Europe has specifically said, quote, in that regulation, PetrOLATum is banned for the use in cosmetic products unless the full refining history is known and the substance from which it is produced is not a carcinogen. So for everyone pointing at PetrOLATum jelly and saying it's a carcinogen, it's gonna cause cancer and it's banned in Europe. No, it's not. Europe allows it, absolutely. They just say if we don't know where it's derived from, then they won't allow it. So they are looking at impurities that can sometimes go along with the petroleum or PetrOLATum jelly, and they're saying these impurities that can cause cancer are bad. And that doesn't mean that petroleum jelly is banned. It means the contaminants are banned if they are found within the petroleum jelly. So the petroleum jelly is not bad, the contaminant is bad. But just because the contaminant is a bad thing and they won't allow it, that doesn't mean the petroleum jelly is a bad thing. It's just that if this over here, this PJ, has this contaminant in it, then the European Union won't allow it. And that makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, in 60-second videos on the internet, people take this fact and they run with it, saying that it's toxic and it's banned in Europe. It's not. Think about it. Even drinking water would be banned if we found lead in it. That doesn't make the water bad. It makes the contaminant bad. Ugh. Internet! Now, some people have also claimed that it clogs pores. First off, that is not universally true. If it were, then that means every single person who ever used it would get a clogged pore. And is that the case? No. Well, some doctors, some derms, and some experts actually wanted to look into this and said, does it clog pores or not? There was specifically a review that was done in 2023 that looked at the comedogenicity of PetrOLAtum jelly. Basically, how likely is it for this to cause acne in certain people? And the results were very interesting. Several studies claimed that PetrOLAtum is comedogenic due to its physical properties. However, none of the people who were claiming this provided references to back up that claim. So everyone who was saying it was nasty and breaking them out, there was actually nothing that we could look at to verify that. And this is why science needs to be repeatable. PetrOLAtum was originally reported to be comedogenic, meaning it causes acne. When mild comedogenicity resulted, basically little pimples started to appear when this PetrOLAtum was continuously applied. Now this was under occlusion for 6 weeks in human studies. However, in a study after that, the same authors reported an improvement in the acne papules with PetrOLAtum use. So for some people it causes pimples, and for other people it takes it away. That is not definitive. And again, if it caused acne, it means that everyone that used it would get it. So at the end of the day, what does that mean for you? If you have acne, you might find benefit from it, or you might not. Now when it comes to this actual substance, we know that it is great to prevent transepidermal water loss. Let's break down that word. Trans meaning across, epidermal talking about the epidermis of the skin. So across the epidermis of the skin, and water loss is water loss. You know this by now. You're skin intellectual. So if it prevents this water loss from the skin, it can trap in moisture, it can help with wound healing, and it can support a healthy skin barrier. And that's why doctors and derms love Vaseline or PetrOLAtum jelly or PetrOLEum for people who have eczema and psoriasis and some of these really dry skin conditions that involve a lot of transepidermal water loss. And again, a lot of people will point at doctors and derms and be like, ew, it's this nasty goo, why are you recommending this? Again, as an esthetician who works with doctors and derms, I recommend the cruelty-free version, but it does work really well for some people. And when people say like, oh, it causes acne, or like Europe has banned it, I mean, you now know the truth about that. Some people like to claim that it's flammable because it comes from the oil industry. It's actually not that flammable, okay? And again, just because it comes from the oil industry doesn't mean it's bad. Like, the oil industry comes from rocks, and like oil is like dead decaying dinosaurs and organic matter. Like, we know that, right? And so when people are trying to fearmonger you into buying new products or going natural or clean, you can literally look back at them and be like, well, petroleum is technically natural, like it comes from the rocks, we're just drilling it up. Like, make it make sense here. Now, of course, you don't want to be breathing it into your lungs. If it is injected into your veins, of course that's terrible. There's a lot of things that shouldn't be injected into your veins. But when applied topically to the skin, it can have a lot of benefits. I mean, of course, if you're concerned about it, don't use it. I've actually filmed a video on some alternatives for if it does break you out or if you feel yucky about it. But there's a huge difference between not wanting to use it versus actually fear-mongering and using that fear to try to sell people on this idea of spend $500 on my cream. And again, speaking of $500 creams, La Mer literally has PetrOLAtum as one of their ingredients in their amazing moisturizer. $400 for this little tiny tube of seaweed, and it has PetrOLAtum in it. Like, just make it make sense, people. Make it make sense. I am done with my rant. Let me know what you think of this. That's the history for you. I now hope you know the difference. Always remember to stay hydrated and reapply that sunscreen and to be beautiful both inside and out, and be a skin intellectual. Learn the history of your skincare, babes. I love you, and I can't wait to see you in this next video. Love you guys. Bye.